Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Mark Turner, the External Relations Director of SRM 360, and welcome to our last live discussion of the year, which we hope is going to be a clear-eyed discussion of the future of emissions and what that means for climate policy. Our goal at SRM 360 is to support an informed discussion about sunlight reflection methods, also known as solar geoengineering or SRM, and that includes exploring the context in which these ideas are being considered. We don't take a position on whether SRM should be deployed or not, but we do support its research and broad-based discussions on the best way forwards. So thank you for coming. I hope you enjoy the discussion. Please ask any questions you may have for the panelists in the Q&A as we go along. You'll see a little button at the bottom of the screen there, the Q&A. We'll direct these questions to the panelists both halfway through, focusing on emissions trajectories, and at the end, focusing on some discussion around additional strategies. Please do keep them short and pertinent to the discussion. And I will now turn over to Pete Irvin, our editorial director.
Thanks, Mark. So, COP30 in Brazil marked 10 years since the Paris Climate Agreement, the first legally binding international climate agreement. Now, it introduced new goals for climate policy to limit global warming well below 2 and to make efforts to limit to 1.5 Celsius. It also established a new policy framework. Rather than fighting over who should cut emissions by how much, countries bound themselves to setting emissions targets, though didn't bind themselves to meeting them. The hope has been that countries would ratchet up their ambitions over time, encouraging each other, sharing what works, and so that collectively progress would be made towards the shared goal of halting global warming. But in the years since, CO2 emissions have continued to go up, though not nearly as quickly as before, as we'll see in this chart. So here you can see fossil fuel CO2 emissions, which grew by only 9% in the years since 2015 compared to 16% in the years before. But once you factor in land use, you can see it's actually quite a little bit better, with emissions having only risen 3% since Paris. So it looks like we're getting close to emissions peaking. In this panel discussion, we will look ahead so that we can better understand the near and long-term prospects for emissions cuts and consider whether and how carbon dioxide removal and solar geoengineering might play a role alongside these other policies in managing rising temperatures. To explore this issue, we'll look to recent reports, our own informal survey of the solar geoengineering community, and to expert insights from our wonderful panel. We have Simon Evans, a deputy editor and senior policy editor at Carbon Brief, where he focuses on climate and energy policy. We have David Keith, a professor of geophysical science and the founding faculty director of the Climate Systems Engineering Initiative at the University of Chicago, where I work. He has published over 200 papers. He founded Carbon Engineering, a direct air capture carbon dioxide removal company, and he previously led Harvard's Solar Geoengineering Research Program. And finally, we're joined by Matt Burgess, an assistant professor of economics at the University of Wyoming, whose research examines economic growth, environmental change, and political polarization. His work combines modeling, statistical analysis, and public communications. So, Simon, it's quite discouraging that CO2 emissions have continued to rise since Paris. But what's your take on the progress that's been made?
Yeah, thanks, Pete. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for having me. I mean, look, I don't think we should be under any illusions. We've already seen the first individual year in 2024 above 1.5 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels. We're already seeing widespread and fairly catastrophic climate impacts from extreme weather events in particular. And we're very clearly not on track to meet the Paris Agreement temperature goal. But as I think you sort of implied, we're definitely doing a lot better than we thought we were a decade ago. So we were heading for 3.5+ degrees a decade ago, according to projections. And now we're looking at more like 2.5 degrees, or with the potential to continue improving that. So I think, yeah, roughly speaking, that's where we are. Better than we were doing, but not as well as we need to be.
Thanks. So, David, you've been tracking the climate issue for perhaps the longest of us on this panel. What's your take on where things stand?
I think it's a really exciting time in the sense that the emissions trajectory really looks like it's changing, and the flow of money into clean energy and the capital in clean energy, the actual flow of equipment, is just completely different than it's been. So I don't pay as much attention to what politicians say. I pay more attention to what's happening on the ground and the flow of sort of clean energy stock. In the end, to solve the emissions problem, you need to replace dirty energy infrastructure with clean energy infrastructure. And the pace at which that's happening is utterly different than it's been for most of the last 30 or 40 years. We're now spending roughly 2% of the entire world's economy on clean energy. And it seems likely to me, we can talk about the uncertainties, that we'll see a peak of emissions, not a messy peak with bounces in the next couple of years, basically now. And that's extraordinary.
Yeah, and am I right that the investment in clean energy now outpaces the spending on fossil fuels, or have we not quite reached that point?
No, if you're talking about upstream fossil fuels, it's been higher than that for a long time. So that's quite a few years ago. We're now at about Bloomberg New Energy Finance has us about 2 trillion of clean energy investment, and last time I looked, upstream was like 500 billion or something. I may be out of date, but it bounces around. It's that kind of number.
Sure,
I think
thanks.
overall we're looking at like roughly 2 to 1 clean energy to fossil fuels.
Yeah.
There's some questions always in what you're measuring. Basically, do you measure just the upstream extraction or the infrastructure for electricity generation? But either way, it's a really big change. And I think I don't find it so disappointing that emissions are up since Paris. I guess that's only true if you really thought that Paris 1.5 was a actually sensible policy. I think Paris 1.5 was a brilliant piece of environmentalist strategy, which has helped to get us where we are, and I totally celebrate it. I don't think, in my memory of conversations that I had at the time, I don't think I or many of the people arguing with 1.5 expected it actually would be met, or maybe even should be met in some kind of utilitarian optimum. The idea of having a really short-term boundary like 1.5 was so we'd rapidly be blowing through it, so we could put more pressure to try and push fossil fuels out, to put more political pressure to get change. And that's worked.
Excellent. Well, Matt, so this is like the Paris Agreement is built on the idea of ever ratcheting climate ambition, but are we starting to see some of that ambition falling away? I mean, we're seeing a rise of populist politics. Should we expect support for climate action to weaken in the coming years?
Yeah, so I think there's two things that are going on here at the same time, and they combine to produce the pattern that globally the emissions per dollar GDP have been falling linearly for since the 1960s, and in the United States, total emissions have been falling linearly since the George W. Bush administration, despite huge changes in the vibes of different presidential administrations. The two things that are going on, the first is that the economics of renewables are getting better and better, and the economics of lower carbon fossil fuels like natural gas compared to higher fossil carbon um, fossil fuels like coal are also getting better, and that's trading an economic drag down on emissions that I don't think politics can stop. The second thing that's going on that I think is getting more attention is that the public in democratic countries where I've seen the data, and I would guess other countries too, has never really been on board with the idea of climate action if it imposes significant costs on the cost of living. And there's been some rhetoric in the climate community pushing for that. There's been some rhetoric in the climate community pushing for climate action tied to, in the context of the popular discussion, pretty niche, elite kind of social justice issues. And I think the public is kind of revolting against that. And I think that we're going to see a decline in that, and we already are in the public sphere. But I don't think that those things can stop the economic pull, which is the main pull down on emissions. And there are also some, the United States has some policies recently that maybe are trying to push further than just going back to whatever's cheapest. But even that might have unclear effects. So for example, Africa has been seeing a solar boom in the last year, partly because China is flooding Africa with cheap solar that they're worried the United States isn't going to buy anymore, right? So maybe that's going to accelerate Africa's transition. The Yale Budget Lab estimates that the economic costs of the tariff policies in the United States might be large enough that if you apply the current carbon intensity of US GDP, that economic hit from tariffs might reduce U.S. emissions by the equivalent of closing all of Wyoming's coal plants, right? So we have this weird thing where the vibes are really different on climate and emissions maybe than they were 2 years ago, but it's not at all clear to me that we're gonna move the needle up much in terms of dragging emissions back up.
Great. Cool. Well, one of the big motivations for our work at SRM 360 is the worry that emissions might not happen fast enough to prevent climate change from having some really harmful impacts. But what's likely when it comes to emissions cuts? Just how much warming should we expect to see? So we're going to look at this in some stages. So looking at the near-term projections and then out to long-term, and then thinking about carbon dioxide removal, its potential, and then solar geoengineering. So before I get to the results of the survey we did with the geoengineering community and what our panelists think, I'd like to poll our audience for their predictions for near-term emissions. So, compared to today, in 10 years' time, CO2 emissions will be 20% higher or more, about 10% higher, roughly the same as today, about 10% lower, or 20% lower or more. What do you think? Let's just wait a few seconds for you to press the buttons, and then Kerry can show us the answers.
10 years is close enough that you should consider posting some kind of bond and offering a prize or setting up some kind of betting market.
I'm sure someone has already done that, haven't they? Maybe we can go make a bet after this.
I think Patrick Brown maybe has done that at Interactive Brokers, but I have to check.
Oh, excellent. Kerry, so can we see the answers here? All right. They should pop up. Here we go. All right. It looks like our audience is leaning towards about the same / a little more towards 10% lower. All right. So let's see how that compares. Great. So one way to predict perhaps near-term emissions cuts is to look to what countries say they're going to do to their emissions commitments. So David, the Paris Agreement asked countries to submit what's called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. What are those NDCs, and what can they tell us about near-term emissions?
I'm going to I guess your premise is correct as you said it. One way to estimate emissions is to look to what countries say. I don't think it's a particularly useful way. I think there are a set of political forces that, quite understandable, that cause politicians to make claims that are kind of quite divorced from their actions. I don't think that's going to shock any listener of any democracy or non-democracy. And so I just don't think it's that important, or not in a direct one-to-one way. If I'm looking at what I think emissions are going to be, I'm looking at what the forces shaping them are, what the flow of capital stock are. I'm looking at what the non-political estimators like Wood Mackenzie or Rystad are estimating for emissions. And I'm not paying that much attention to what governments do because there's lots of reasons why on all sorts of topics, governments tend to overpromise because the political system rewards them for that. I think we really need to focus on the actual hard rules and the ways that political forces around climate are changing the flow into the capital stock.
Yeah. Simon, anything you want to add on that one?
Yeah, I mean, so Carbon Brief, we tend to be fairly evidence-led and not kind of try and come to our own kind of speculative conclusions. And so, I mean, there's a couple of different reports out there which are, widely respected that you can look at and get an answer to your question. So we're talking about basically 2035 emissions. The UN climate body did a synthesis report, so-called, of all of the climate pledges, the new climate pledges that countries had made ahead of COP30 that just finished in Brazil. And I mean, this to David's point, this is a question of looking at what countries have promised, right? And they said, if you added up all of those promises, assume they're met, you get to something like 12% below 2019 levels by 2035. Obviously, we're now above 2019 levels, so it'd be like more than 12% below current levels, right? But then a different way to look at it would be to not take those pledges at face value. So the IEA's World Energy Outlook does exactly that with its stated policy scenario. They look at what countries have said, but they also make a value judgment, like, are there policies in place is there kind of significant progress in actually implementing the things that they would need to do? And once we add those things up, not just the current policies that are already in place, but also the things that are firmly in train, where do you get to then? And I've just looked in the tables for the latest World Energy Outlook, and I think it's about 7% below current levels by 2035. So you're kind of getting ballpark to what your audience is saying, actually, about 10%, more or less.
Great. Well, let's look at, Linus should have a slide here looking at, so this is the historical emissions, and then these are the UNEP gap reports. So the current policies where countries sort of continue current trends, sort of plateaus, the conditional NDCs, the slightly more ambitious ones. And I should explain the NDCs, these are the country's emissions commitments. They're tallying up of what they're going to do. And then you can see the quite large gap between those and the 2 Celsius target and the much larger gap to the 1.5 Celsius target. So progress is being made. It looks well according to these projections, but not nearly enough to meet these targets. Let me go. So I just get a question.
But again, that's partly by construction. So, if I'm an environmental activist, and which I kind of am, unless my friends are, I want to encourage the political system to set unmeetable targets so I can accuse them of breaking them, so I can up the political force. That's the goal. That doesn't mean I objectively thought those targets were the right things. If you'd actually made a hard cap on emissions to meet 1.5, I think you could easily argue the harms, especially to some people in developing countries, would have been big enough it wouldn't have made sense. So I'm just not kind of buying into that this gap is some correct gap. I mean, if you look at models of optimal climate policy, they didn't say aim for 1.5.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, I guess next thing I wanted to do was to show there's been if you could put so Matt, how much difference has climate policy made so far? There was a graph doing the runs recently from the UN Climate Change Secretariat claiming to show the difference between where emissions were headed pre-Paris in the red here, putting us on track for 3.5 or 4.5 Celsius, something like that, and where we're headed now, which is this purple current policies track, pulling that down to maybe something like 2.5 Celsius. That suggests that enormous progress has been made. But you've looked at those scenarios in red. These are the sort of business as usual. An SSP is shared socioeconomic pathways in this little code on the end here. These scenarios that you've looked into, what's your take on what they represent? And did they represent where we were headed were it not for climate action?
For the most part, no, they didn't, particularly the high ones. I mean, SSP 5, 8.5 asks you to believe that by 2100, we're going to be so rich that the average income in today's poorest countries is roughly equivalent to an entry-level Google employee today. And we're going to have gotten there through a mega coal bonanza that rolls back all climate policy we have today and all of the economic advantages that natural gas, for example, has over coal. And we're going to be so unconcerned about climate change that we're going to do that despite the fact that the kinds of warming you get by the end of the century in SSP 5 8.5 might make large swaths of the tropics, barely livable for humans 300 days a year, right? So that's a ridiculous scenario that never for many reasons represented where we were heading. In terms of just the time frame in this graph, kind of, from 2010, say, to 2035, historically, most of the deviation from reality compared to these scenarios has actually come from economic growth per capita being slower than we expected, which, probably isn't climate policy, and if it is, we should be worried, right? And that's actually particularly the case in developing countries. So developing countries in particular have grown slower than we expected. I would argue, and I have argued in papers, largely because we had unrealistic expectations in our main models about how fast income convergence would happen, because we really want it to happen, because that would be great for society. The other kind of secondary reason is technology has outpace the scenarios. One area, as I mentioned before, is gas replacing coal. It's sort of hard to blame that on climate policy, right? The other one is renewables. Do you see an inflection where Paris happens and then all of a sudden the curve bends down? In my opinion, you don't. But that doesn't mean that climate policies haven't done anything. For example, the subsidies for renewables, for research have been really important. Some of the early in the US state level policies for renewable portfolio standards spurred investment and innovation, which then helped renewables spread to other states where they didn't have it. So I'd say climate policy has had an effect, but if I had to guess, something like 3/4 maybe of that gap at least is not caused by climate policy.
Yeah. David, anything you want to add to that?
I think it's one of the hardest questions to answer. I think, like many of Matt's points, and he might be right, but I actually think it's really objectively hard to know how much of the change is climate policy, partly because this involves technological learning and it involves inferences about what would have happened in some other world. So, I mentioned before this objective number, we have about 2 trillion on clean energy, but what fraction of that is just economic pull that would happen if somehow, let's say there was some magic, infinitely cheap carbon removal scheme so that climate went off the table as a problem. You'd still be installing a lot of solar, but I think it would be quite different. I actually think that climate policy in various complicated ways, filtering through investment chains and decisions in different national policies, some which were labeled climate and some not. I think climate policy is actually quite important, but I can't prove that. Matt might be wrong. It's very actually hard to tell. We can see what's happening, but we can't easily see why it's happening.
And just to build off that,
Right.
there's two things going on here, right? One is, was the baseline we're comparing to realistic to begin with, right? Which is almost a orthogonal question to how important has climate policy been, right?
Agreed. And Matt, I want to pick
Yeah.
up one thing I completely agree with and other not. So your statement about income conversions, completely agreed. And even back in the early days when we were talking climate policy back, 30 years ago when you were probably a lot younger, well, 30 years younger, we realized that the income conversion stuff was maybe over optimistic. It just politically had to be there. But the other part, what you said is that sort of the 8.5 or what we used to call F1, whatever, F1A something, that was high because climate would be so dangerous, people would respond. But of course, the whole point of that scenario was essentially what would happen if there was no worry about climate. So it's not fair to include that part.
Great. I'd like to skip forward a little bit on our originally planned schedule here and jump to the long-term emissions projections from these different scenarios people have made. So we can get that one up. We should have that shortly. So yeah, this is going to extend. This is the UNEP emissions gap report extended a little out to 2050, and now we're going to add on some of the other longer-term current policy projections. And you can see, I think, Simon, you mentioned some of these. But let me just go through this. So yeah, Simon, do you want to actually let's add one more line on here. So these are the kind of current policy projections, and the next line is the median of what our survey participants thought was likely.
So can I just raise it using the word current policy projections for something going out over 80 years is something that climate people are used to saying, but I don't know if I'm allowed to say this on your podcast, but it's utter bullshit. Humans have no capacity to do that. If you look at the energy forecasts that were made in the 60s and 70s and compare them to reality, the spread of answers is enormous. This is just, we can publish papers that say this, but we lack the capacity to make these projections reliably.
Right. Well, I was going to ask you a question about that in a second, David, but that's fine. Anyway, Simon, what's your take on these? Obviously, I think that David's pointed out rightly that in the longer term, these are getting pretty sketchy. But is there a consensus now that we've effectively reached a peak in emissions?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's striking about this, if I think I'm right in assuming the IEA line in there, which is a little bit hidden, is the current policy scenario, which is what they just reintroduced, right? Now, that's a really conservative scenario. That assumes that countries around the world completely abandon all of the things that they said they want to do. So they only the policies that are currently on the books stay in place. All of the pledges that they've made, sure, the US is ripping up climate pledges left, right, and centre, but actually, despite the vibes, not a lot of other countries are doing that in a wholesale manner. So the idea that countries around the world are going to tear up all of their stated policy intentions doesn't really stack up. And what you can see is that even in that quite unlikely and quite conservative scenario, emissions are peaking, albeit to a plateau, right? And that's obviously not going to get us to net zero, and it's not going to stop the planet getting hotter. But I think that we are, it does seem like there is increasing consensus. I mean, you haven't put an OPEC projection on here, right? You haven't put the EIA's projection on here. I think you might get some wilder kind of emissions keep going up forever type lines if you'd included some of those types of organizations. But I think, yeah, broadly speaking, most people are saying, we're at or close to peak emissions. And then what happens next, it really depends. And, as David has very eloquently put, it's quite hard to say. I mean, I think, looking at that rhodium line, for example, I don't know what you have to believe to think that emissions start falling rapidly and then suddenly start taking off again. It's quite hard to imagine a world in which that would be true. But equally, the survey respondents look like they're more optimistic than a lot of those other bodies.
Great. Well, it's actually we've got one more slide for if we can add the other survey answers. So that's just the median. Are somewhere a little more optimistic and others more pessimistic, as you can see here. I'm not sure who's trying to get in there, but please go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say I'm pretty sure. I mean, I don't know the Rhodium Group's guts of their model, but it reminds me a lot of some of the SSP database scenarios, which for some reason have a coal rebound in the second half of the century, which I agree with Simon is unlikely. Yeah, I mean, if I had to guess, I would say that in the next 10 years, we might be doing a little bit worse than we expect, just because some of the short-term pressures combined with some of the AI boom. But I think in the long term, technology, it keeps exceeding expectations. The IEA keeps bending its stated policies down for 2050, even though its stated policies projections in kind of the next 2 or 3 years have actually been missed, have been too optimistic for the last couple of years. So I wouldn't be surprised if we're, at or slightly worse than what the IEA is showing for the next 10 years, but then we kind of bend down close to where your survey is later in the century. I'm a strong believer in the wisdom of crowds.
Excellent. Well, nice way to flatter our audience there. Let's now move to Q&A for a little while. We should have some questions that have come in, but if you've got more, please do chuck them in the Q&A section. And I'll pass over to Mark to ask some of these.
Sure, and I guess we've got a couple of minutes, and we're also going to have some more time at the end. Got one question which came in beforehand from Charles Agallo. How have are global carbon markets helping to reduce or fuel carbon emissions? Who should I ask that to first? Shall I start with Simon or?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one of the interesting things that's been happening with carbon markets is the real proliferation in the number of countries adopting or talking about very seriously, starting to adopt carbon markets. And there's, I think, a pretty strong argument that you could make that is partly as a result of the EU's adoption of their carbon border adjustment mechanism, where effectively, David, it looks like you want to say something, but yeah, no, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with you. And we are hearing much more talk about it. And I do think the carbon border adjustment mechanism is part of it. And I really salute it. I also want to give a perspective. This is about what may happen. And at least over sort of 35 years or something I've been involved, I've endlessly gone to talks of economists talking about carbon markets. But in the main, the way that climate policies have actually worked, carbon markets have had a pretty relatively small role. That might change in the future. And I think there really are good reasons why carbon markets might be a really efficient way to manage it. But it's important to say that till now, they haven't been. And if you think about the big things that have moved it, we were mentioning before, complicated to say what policy was, but the Germans' extraordinary early solar subsidies that were ridiculously economically ineffective in terms of cutting emissions in Germany in dollars a ton cost were enormously valuable to the world in terms of igniting the solar learning curve.
Yeah, I think you prefigured nicely what I was going to go on to say, that there's been something proliferation of carbon markets as a policy instrument, but in terms of whether they're having a huge impact, that's much harder to say. I mean, you look at obviously the really big one is China's carbon market, where it's not a carbon market in the sense that most people will understand. And the idea that it's had a huge impact on emissions in China is pretty questionable. So yeah, I think I broadly agree with you.
Yeah. I would just add, the economist perspective. I think there's two types of carbon markets, right? There's the government carbon markets and the voluntary carbon markets. The government carbon market problem is political, and it's part of a larger class of political problems, which is that people don't want a tax on everything, even if that's the most efficient way to incentivize change. Or, in parallel, like the value added tax is probably the most efficient way to raise government revenue, but good luck proposing that if you're in the United States, for example. So that's the political problem. I think on the voluntary side, you have a scaling problem. So voluntary carbon markets, I think the two big headwinds that they're facing in terms of scaling, this is where companies voluntarily sell and buy offsets. The two big headwinds they're facing, one is there's something like a bubble. If you look at the investments in ESG, they kind of go way up and peak in kind of 2021, 2022, and then they kind of come way down. And I think that's kind of a asset bubble dynamics. And the second thing is that if you are trying to basically look good as a company by investing and buying these things, you don't really want to buy a bunch of cheap, efficient carbon credits at large quantities. You want to buy a bunch of little high quality ones that you can cut ribbons on, and that's not good for scaling.
It's also worth adding that I mean the carbon those sort of voluntary carbon markets have a pretty poor record in terms of actually cutting emissions in addition to what's already happening.
Again, because the objective is marketing, not cutting emissions, right?
Well, whatever the reasons, there's pretty good evidence that they're being quite ineffectual.
Again, Matt, back to the fact that it's easier to observe what's happening than to know why it's happening. So I think the answer is there's a mixture of objectives, and there really are serious corporates who, for different reasons, are actually kind of motivated by climate, but it's really hard to know. To be clear, I don't think the voluntary carbon market is very important one way or the other, but.
Let's have one quick last question
Well,
here.
I mean, this has been a very good discussion, and I know we're running on. I mean, I can ask one more question, or we could save some for the end. And also, I would also encourage, since I don't want to curtail some of this rich discussion, we can also continue some of these discussions on our social media platform as well, when we'll be posting this thing. But would you want time for one more question, Pete?
Sure, if people can answer it a little more quickly than that one.
Sure. Well, I'll do this one just because it's in a lot of people's minds. I'm not sure if we've already touched on the impact of policy, and I'm not sure if people will accept the full question, but is it possible to estimate by how much, to what degree global climate will be affected by the increase in US emissions, if that's the case, expected under Trump's policies? Would anyone like to take that one?
I would just quickly say, if you consider both direct and indirect effects, I think we don't totally know that US emissions will increase. It might increase by a little bit, but we really don't know if global emissions will increase given the indirect effects, right? The two examples I gave were if we increase our support for fossil fuels, but we also hurt our economy through tariffs, that actually might be a wash in terms of the net effects on US emissions. And if Africa gets flooded with solar and then gets on a technological leapfrogging path because it's really cheap because Americans aren't buying it, right? That also could have a big reduction in global emissions. So yeah, I don't know. I'm going to post a link in the chat of something I wrote about this recently, a couple things actually. But yeah, I don't think we know.
To the extent that reducing trade and the other things Trump are doing reduces economic growth, it might well be that Trump is a benefit to climate.
Great. Well, let's now move on back to the discussion. And so I'd like to poll the audience again. So our second poll should turn up shortly. So global temperatures will reach a peak value of what? Should be the question when it comes up. I'll start reading out the answers you can give. Less than 2 Celsius, roughly 2 Celsius, 2.5 Celsius, 3 Celsius, or more than 3.5 Celsius. So what does our audience think? Global temperatures will reach a peak of what? What are they likely to reach a peak of? Cool. So we will give that a little moment for people to fill in. And I think once we've got 40 or so answers, I'm sure we can get a rough sense of where people have got to. So hopefully we'll see what we'll see. Okay, so it looks like our audience puts us at about 2.7 Celsius, maybe 2.5 Celsius looks like the median response here. Great, so let's close that. So if the audience is right, David, and we're on track for roughly 2.5 Celsius, how bad would that be? Big question. If you could give a relatively concise answer, that would be fab.
Bad. But like climate, it's very dependent on who you are and where you are. So for poor people, especially poor older people living in hot countries, it's really quite bad. Where quite bad means kind of a worse than bad air pollution or equivalent to bad air pollution. And if you're in a rich northern country, the answer is bad if you care about the natural environment, but in terms of direct human utility, not such a big impact.
I mean, it's worth stressing for people who aren't so familiar. Air pollution is the largest killer, is that right? Like just a sense of how bad is air pollution if people aren't
Of a
familiar with that.
human of a human environmental pollutant, yes, but still several million a year.
Yeah. Great. Well, certainly enough to warrant action. So Simon, let's presume things go a little better than our audience presumes. We could still be unlucky. There's significant uncertainty in what's called the Earth's climate sensitivity. Could you explain that and how much of a difference being unlucky in that regard could make?
Yeah, so these projections of how hot it will get as emissions, go up or down, and depending how much they go down, depend on an assumption about how sensitive the Earth's climate is to each ton of emissions. And there's over many years there's been an effort to get a precise answer to that question: how sensitive is the climate? And although the range of estimates has narrowed quite significantly, we no longer think climate sensitivity is very low, and we no longer think it's very high. There's still quite a wide range of plausible values, if you like, roughly around 3 degrees of warming per what is it, per doubling of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. And so, yeah, we basically the temperature projections that we saw from like the IEA, UNEP, etc., where they're saying like about 2.5 degrees, that's based on the kind of central estimate of sensitivity. So if we're unlucky, if the climate turns out to be more sensitive than our best estimate, then that means we would see, for the same emissions, we would see more warming.
Am I right that it's roughly a 50% range? So it's sort of 3 is the central estimate and 4.5 is sort of the 1 in 6 worst outcome. Maybe David could jump in here if you want to.
David may well know better than I do, yeah.
No, I don't think I do. I mean, I was involved in early expert judgment stuff on climate sensitivity. I think to me, the big improvement has been separating out longer term and short term, what's now called transient equilibrium climate sensitivity. I'm not sure that the real uncertainties have decreased I mean, they've decreased. How much is arguable?
Yeah. Great. So Matt, one of the much of the climate discussion focuses on the year 2100 because it's a nice round number, but obviously this is the problem that will run on beyond 2100. So what can we expect if we fail to eliminate CO2 emissions by then?
Succinctly, you can expect the climate to keep getting warmer, right? Uh, so yeah, it's true that our models tend to end in 2100, particularly on the socioeconomic side. I think even predicting that far is pretty ambitious, right? Socioeconomically. But yeah, I mean, this is a problem. The core characteristic of what makes this problem vexing is that the benefits and costs of doing something about it are poorly matched in time and space, with the exception of these already economically beneficial technologies. And so, that problem gets worse, the further out you go.
Great. Well, let's flag up a little chart here. So this is one we've produced in-house. We should have this up in 1 second. Yeah, so this is showing that longer term perspective for a scenario where we never cut emissions. You can see here it's temperature against time, and it goes out to 2400. So if you don't cut emissions, the planet just keeps warming and warming. And the next slide shows, at least in the model we used, if you eliminate CO2 emissions, so you don't add any more than you take away from the atmosphere, temperatures wouldn't start falling. They'd fall very, very slowly. You'd effectively get a long-term plateau, so that even if we eliminate emissions, the planet remains warm. So let's move on. So that scenario we've got here we're not just cutting emissions, you need to go beyond that because there's a certain degree of residual emissions, right, Simon? How low could emissions get without carbon dioxide removal?
Yeah, so I mean, net zero depends on, because there's certain things that it's very difficult to do without emitting, and that might be like, certain crops, like rice, for example, and certain, industries like aviation, where it's pretty tricky to imagine a zero emission version of those activities. So I don't know exact numbers, but I'm guessing, we're at, say, roughly 50 billion tons a year of greenhouse gas emissions. And I guess we're talking maybe 5 to 10 billion residual emissions in a net zero scenario. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I would reflect on this is that, so we talk about hard to abate sectors, the sectors where it's hard to get to zero. But the scope and size of those hard to abate emissions has been shrinking. So just to take one example, like at one point we would have said, heavy long distance trucking, heavy goods vehicles, what we call in Europe heavy goods vehicles, those are going to be really tough to decarbonize, because you need a really big battery and it's going to be too expensive and heavy and stuff. And now you see like a massive surge in battery trucks in China particularly, but also in Europe. And so the idea that that kind of sector is not going to be easy to decarbonize is kind of slipping away. Now, I don't want to kind of sound like a Pollyanna-ish about this, but that there's definitely a smaller and smaller pie of those hard to abate emissions that's going to be left over.
I agree. There's not a fixed residual that's meaningful. It really depends on technological change we can't forecast very well. And I think, shout out to my own Energy versus Climate podcast, it's really unclear if hard to abate is actually hard to abate in terms of objectively high carbon prices, or industries that have been politically successful in pushing that view so they haven't been pushed. I mean, thinking about cement plants, which is this big kind of 6%-ish of global emissions, cement is not traded internationally that much. We know how to do CCS on cement plants, and it is not big technological uncertainties. It hasn't been done because it's a big point capital cost, but I don't think because it's objectively that hard in terms of dollars a ton carbon.
So David, just another big question, looking for a relatively concise answer. Carbon dioxide removal, what are the main categories and what constraints do they face? I mean, could this come along and save the day if we fail to cut emissions quickly?
I'd say three broad categories. Carbon can be stored in organics, in reduced carbon that is in soils and trees, but that's inherently not permanent. And so it's inherently a kind of stock and flow where you're not really reversing the long-term problem of moving from geological reservoirs to the biosphere. And then there's putting actual gaseous CO2 deep underground, which could be done from direct air capture or from biomass with capture. And then there's things that are all about essentially enhancing weathering. So CO2 is a weak acid, and the Earth is filled with bases, and they inherently want to react to make salts. Acid plus base equals salts. That's what happens naturally anyway. If there was no CO2 flowing into the atmosphere, CO2 concentrations would crash so much that plants would die. The reason that doesn't happen has been equilibrium is because of vents from volcanoes and other vents deep underground. So there are lots of ways we could accelerate that weathering. I think the most important ones are open ocean alkalinity. And I think there's no question that it's technically possible to remove 5, 10 gigatons a year of CO2 by some of these methods, but we do not understand the costs or environmental impacts very well, and none of this is going to happen very soon.
Yeah. Great. Well, let's move on to a bit more controversial topic, and the main one we focus on at SRM 360. So, Simon, you were at COP30, I believe. SRM or solar geoengineering wasn't mentioned there, I don't think, but overshoot was. How important do you think this idea of overshoot that will go past a certain temperature and they need carbon dioxide removal to slowly drive us down? How important will that be in future climate discussions? Now we're crossing 1.5 Celsius. And what might it mean for the consideration of solar geoengineering?
Yeah, so I mean, just to say, I wasn't personally at the COP. The accommodation costs in Belém were sky high, so we sent a smaller team from Carbon Brief this year, but I was following very closely. You mentioned overshoot. So for the first time in a COP decision text, one of the legal documents that comes out of these annual meetings, there's a mention of the idea of overshoot. So previously, where the Paris Agreement talked about pursuing efforts to keep warming below 1.5 degrees, there's now a line saying, we're going to continue pursuing efforts to keep warming below 1.5 degrees, and we're also going to pursue efforts to limit the length and the duration and the size of any overshoot above 1.5 degrees. And obviously that's a new thing for them to talk about. And obviously the reason being obviously that we've already had 1 year above 1.5. And that means, it's not going to be too long until we've had, 5 years and 10 years and then like a long-term average temperature of warming of more than 1.5. So people are sort of starting to recognize that at the political level. And that in itself is very significant and interesting. I suppose it's partly, stemming from that thing like, oh God, we've breached 1.5, what now? And so people, and then they talk to scientists and scientists say, well, we're going to overshoot, but we can come back down afterwards. I mean, I think it's worth saying that even the sort of basically all scenarios involve some level of carbon dioxide removal. Mitigation scenarios getting down below 1.5 or 2 degrees. And then the question is how much, and do you go to net zero emissions in CO2 terms, or do you go to net negative emissions and therefore start reducing temperatures after a period of overshoot? And I think, it's sort of quite a new idea in political discussions. People are suggesting, countries might need to have targets that not only go to net zero, but go to net negative at a national level. I don't know how kind of far progressed those are. But it's certainly that idea, those ideas are being socialized now. I think probably it's fair to say to a much greater extent than the idea of solar radiation management, which is still, to put it bluntly, kind of more fringy. It's more something that's being discussed in the media, but not really so much at the political or the kind of COP process level, as far as I can see it.
So David, another big question, looking for a short answer, but were the world to be entering into this overshoot and say we were to use stratospheric aerosol injection, one of these ideas to limit that overshoot or limit the impacts of it, what might we expect to see versus a world where we just follow the emissions trajectory?
The impacts would be limited. But I think arguing for sunlight reflection because of breaching 1.5 is one of the maybe unusual places that I and say Ray Pierre Humbert violently agree. Some of your readers may know we disagree about lots on sunlight reflection, but I think there isn't a sharp threshold at 1.5. There's no scientific basis for it. And using the 1.5 agreement as a justification for SRM, I think is really ethically and political nonsense.
Great. So your very brief answer was expect less harms in a world where SRM
I
being
think
applied.
the broad evidence is that if you do hemispherically balanced, moderate amounts of sunlight reflection using sulfate aerosols, you see a broad-based reduction in the harms of climate change. There are definitely additional harms from doing the SRM, but those appear to be quantifiable with uncertainties with existing knowledge, precisely because of the immense knowledge we have about sulfur and aerosols in the atmosphere. And the evidence from theory and from a wide set of climate models backed up by a sort of century of observations is that this would significantly reduce these harms. Obviously, that's not how many people think about it, but I think that's a fair reading of the evidence.
Great. However, there are several socio-political concerns around them, one of which connects to what we've been talking about today, that developing SRM or deploying SRM would undermine efforts to cut emissions, a concern known as moral hazard or mitigation deterrence. So I'd like to go to now our third poll and see what people think. We also asked this in our survey, and we'll see that in a second. So if solar geoengineering were deployed, it would have what effect on emissions cuts? Would we see a slight acceleration, like more faster emissions cuts? No effect, a slight delay, a significant delay, or a complete abandonment of efforts to cut emissions? Let's see what our audience thinks. Well, once we've got 30, 40 or so, let's see what we have.
I mean, presumably this depends quite a lot on in David's answer just now about the impact of SRM, there were quite a lot of sort of caveats at the beginning about the way in which it's deployed, right? So deployment captures a whole range of different things, right? You could have small scale experimental, you could have balanced hemispheric that David talked about, you could have unilateral, you could have all sorts of varieties of that, and that, those different varieties might have an impact on, the wider effects and
Absolutely.
the political ramifications.
So just on this emissions cuts issue, we can see here our audience is leaning towards a slight delay in emissions cuts, but there's a wide range of answers here. And I think our survey poll had a similar spread of things. We don't necessarily need to show it. Though it's worth noting there, well, yeah, here you see most said zero, or the majority, no, not quite the majority, whatever it is. A large number said zero, but more said there would be some delay in emissions cuts. So it is worth noting there was some pushback against this question, with some people saying, I don't think anyone can predict this and we cannot know an answer to this. But David, what's your take on this question?
I was one of the people who said, I think it didn't pass the omniscience test that we often impose in these expert elicitations, where, like, is it in principle something you could know post facto if you analyze? And I think the answer is no. There are things that are knowable things, but I don't think that's really a knowable thing. There's only one world. There isn't a counterfactual. I mean, a couple of things are important to say. It is rational in a utilitarian sense to cut emissions more slowly with SRM than without it. So in fact, in that sense, if you believe in a kind of utilitarian rightness, it's the right thing to do to cut emissions more slowly. Just to be clear, if we are determining emissions cuts based on a balance of the cost of emissions cuts against future climate harms, which is the mainstream way we think about it, then if those harms are reduced, then you should cut emissions more slowly. So I don't count that as moral hazard. Moral hazard would be, to me, doing an excessive amount of that. But different people have different definitions. But in any case, I think if SRM is used or not used, it will have some effect on the politics of emissions cuts, but I don't know a way to objectively figure out what that is.
Yeah,
even after the fact.
Can I just jump in for a second here? I have a colleague here at Wyoming named Todd Cherry who does really interesting experimental work on this. And my read of the evidence from what he's done and what others have done is that it depends on how risky people think it is. So if people think that SRM, whether or not it is risky, right, to David's earlier point, if people think it's really risky, they might actually accelerate their emissions cuts a little bit if they think that if they don't, somebody's going to, put a bunch of sulfur in the atmosphere, right? But if we do it and it works and the sky doesn't fall, then I think we're totally going to be in David's world where people are going to do less emissions cuts than they would otherwise. And we can debate about whether or not that's moral hazard.
And especially less CDR, slower CDR.
Simon.
Yeah, I mean, I think I tend to agree that it's kind of an unknowable. I mean, I guess what I would also reflect though is that, one of the things that I've observed as climate policy has shifted, not so many years ago in the UK, we had a target of cutting emissions to 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. And that was, then the Paris Agreement came along and 1.5 came along, and now we've got a net zero target. And one of the things that was really clear when that net zero target came into force was that suddenly sectors that had imagined that they wouldn't have to do anything, that they could be in that residual 20%, they suddenly went, oh shit, we've actually got to get with this program. And so, sectors like aviation in particular, maybe heavy industry, some parts of heavy industry, they'd imagined they could hide behind that. So I do think the framing of emissions targets and the extent to which people believe or talk about alternatives to cutting emissions, I do think that has an impact, and it's very hard to kind of judge the level of that. But I think if you look at individual sectors and how they think about their obligations and the level to which they need to do something about their emissions, I'm pretty sure that has been changed by the shift to net zero targets. And by extension, the idea of CDR and SRR, their belief in the availability of those alternatives, probably, I'm pretty sure would have an impact.
Well, we've run a little longer than normal, so I'd like to quickly get to our Q&A for a few questions. Mark.
Sure. And we've got questions from quite a few people, both before the event and during the event, and they kind of cover all sorts of elements. So, in no particular order, I'll kind of grasp on them. We did touch on Trump. So, going back, we have Lloyd Whitman asking back to the emissions trajectories. What are your best predictions for China's emissions, including their continued use of coal versus their investments in clean tech? Would anybody like to take that? Otherwise, how about Matt?
I can go quickly. Yeah. With the caveat that I much more closely follow the U.S. situation than the Chinese situation, my general sense is that China is going to continue to go all in on all of the above. So they're building coal and they're building lots of renewables. I think the technology is going to continue to improve. I also think China faces some pretty significant economic headwinds, both in terms of some domestic issues like their construction bubble and also demographic issues related to their population that I think are going to drag down China's emissions. Now, to be clear, I don't think that's a good thing, right? If China is poorer than we expect it to be, but that will have an impact on their emissions if it happens.
I
Great.
would guess they won't build much more coal. Utilization of coal plants in China has fallen to about 50% as solar has risen. Plus, there's a kind of LNG bubble coming where there's going to be much cheaper LNG prices. There was a bunch of individual building of coal plants with expectation of low capacity factors, but I think they're getting low enough that I think it'll be cut off.
Excellent. So you
Very,
get yeah.
if I may, very briefly, yeah, I mean, we publish a regular analysis on China's emissions and energy trends, and it's pretty clear that they're at or close to a peak. That the exact timing of that is unclear, but lots of different industries and sectors and associations are starting to talk about peaks in coal, demand for coal, oil, and gas separately, and their latest climate pledges to start cutting emissions after 2030. I think the big question, the big unknown is exactly when do they peak, at what level, and how quickly do they come down the other side? And I don't think we know that yet, but we'll get a better idea once we see their the 15th five-year plan published next year.
Great.
Maybe the big thing we haven't talked about is somebody mentioned AI in terms of data centers, I think. And I don't think data centers probably will amount to that much, but the unknowns are huge. But if AI really speeds up economic growth a lot, allowing changes in mobility, changes in city structure, cheaper manufacturing through cheap robots, I think there's a version of that where it does drive emissions up pretty quickly.
I don't know if we have time, but I have a lot of thought there too. But we can move on if.
Go ahead.
Oh, go on. AI is fun. Give it a crack.
Yeah, sure. All right. So I think I agree with David in the long term. I think that the even if the energy demands theoretically from AI go up dramatically, we're so slow at building energy and there's such enormous potential for increasing the efficiency energetically of AI that I think that's going to buffer it in the long term. I do think we're going to see some increase in emissions from it in the short term, but I'm also somewhat bearish on the ability of AI to, create transformative economic growth in the, short to medium term for probably reasons that are not worth getting into in the next 2 minutes. But I'm fairly skeptical of the, kind of extremely bullish economic projections from AI.
I think we could summarize that neither of us knows, simply as a caveat. If it happens, that's one of the ways our projections could be wrong.
Yeah, I'll agree with that.
Let me take one question here from Tom Harris and direct it to David, and please also feel free to sort of address the actual terms of the question. But I just thought it says emissions are obviously crucial, but forcing an EEI has grown faster than expected. Even
the Earth's energy imbalance.
The Earth's energy imbalance. Even exceeding SSP 5 to 8.5, which is the true driver of temperature. What impact does this have on policy and predictions?
I think it doesn't have, well, I mean, it may have through the way public policy works in nonlinear ways, things get discussed, who knows? But in terms of what impact it rationally should have, I think not that much until we know the reasons. So it is true that we're seeing more energy imbalance, more change in albedo than we expected, but it's not well explained by models. So one answer is it's showing that the climate sensitivity really is higher than we thought. That would be Jim Hanson's view. And if that's true, then we should be reacting in various ways, cutting emissions, SRM, whatever. But I don't think we know that. I think the consensus view is that we're not sure that's true. There are different internal dynamics that might be causing it. And if we don't know, then we can't make a conclusion about whether it's climate sensitivity, and in which case, then we shouldn't be drawing policy conclusions.
Well, and if I might just try and explain a couple of things there. So I guess two ideas are, one is we've cleaned up air pollution quite a lot faster than those scenarios had, and so revealed
For sure.
reflecting less
Yeah.
sunlight.
Yeah.
And then the feedback thing you're talking about, this is because as the planet warms, clouds might thin or reflect less light than they otherwise would. And how big an effect that is will determine how much the planet warms in response to warming.
Yeah, very well said. Two things have got to be separated. So part of the acceleration has been accelerated cleanup of air pollution, and that's obviously all to the good. And the fact that it's getting warmer is part of the game, and maybe a good argument for SRM. See the peak Zeke and I wrote in New York Times, but that doesn't tell you anything one way or the other about climate sensitivity. The bigger question is, are these shifts we're seeing in some climate patterns related to climate sensitivity? And that might be true, in which case climate sensitivity is high, but I don't think we know that.
Great.
Right.
I see we're at the end of the hour, so I think if we could wrap up now the official portion, we could probably take a few minutes later to ask a couple more questions if any of our guests can stay on. But just a reminder to all our audience, please follow us on LinkedIn, sign up for our newsletters. Feel free to get in touch with us and ask us any questions in person. We don't have time to get all the questions, but please do come to our social media for a discussion there. So, Pete, I'll just ask you for a quick wrap up.
Well, thanks to our panelists, David Keith, Matt Burgess, and Simon Evans. And I think this has been a really interesting discussion. And if you'd like a few more minutes, hang on the line and we'll ask a few more questions. Thank you. Great. Well,
Great.
here's a few more minutes. Let's go.
Great. Well, let me take one related to SRM that came in before the session began. What impact might SRM, sunlight reflection method, solar geoengineering, have on global primary productivity or photosynthesis? Imagine that's a pretty big question, but David, do you want to crack at that one?
There have been a fair number of modeling studies, and those modeling studies are based on ecosystem models that are reasonable, dating back to, I think, a really early one of Bala's early in the century. And they have generally all showed that SRM increases net primary productivity. Obviously, all else equal, decreasing sunlight does the opposite, but all else isn't equal. You're reducing climate change extremes. You get different answers depending on what the models say about nitrogen limitations. I may have missed some of the recent literature, but my sense is almost all the papers show NPP going up. But Pete may know better than I if there's papers
Well,
contradicting.
I guess I'd add there that the biggest factor is the CO2. So the CO2 directly is expected to boost plant productivity, but is constrained by the amount of nutrients available. And so, yeah, I think that's the biggest factor in climate change. And then whether the warming or the solar geoengineering is better or worse, obviously cooler places benefit in a sense, as in there's more vegetation growth in a warmer world, but the tropics, subtropics, etc., tend to suffer a bit.
One from Javier, I guess related to carbon removal. Emissions are the root cause of the problem, but it is not becoming predominantly, is it not becoming predominantly a stock, as in atmospheric concentrations issue, rather than a flux issue? So is not the seriousness of the situation partly conditional on future CDR deployment, extraction, and durable storage? Who would like to take that one? Simon, do you want to have a... Go ahead.
David, you look like you want to come in, but I mean, just to say, like, CDR is a big, plays a big role in most, sort of deep mitigation scenarios. But fundamentally, this is about cutting emissions as quickly as possible. And so, the CDR is, you can't just forget about CDR and pick it up later if you want to make use of it. You need to start thinking about that now. But fundamentally, it's the cutting the emissions, and we know how to do like the bulk of that, right? We have technologies that we, whether it's for cement or cars or for the power sector, the bulk of our emissions, we know how to cut them, and mostly cost effectively.
Agreed exactly with what Simon said, that the priority now should be emissions cuts, but that if we want the option to do large-scale CDR later, we need to be doing a little bit now, meaning to me kind of a few percent of the spending on emissions cuts on CDR to truly kind of understand what the costs are, what the environmental impacts are. But I actually really love the framing of the person's question, and it looks to the future where we may get to a place where emissions are mostly down. This becomes a stock management problem, and that's different because without a time machine, it's kind of irrelevant who you blame the stock on. You just have to manage it. And then that really looks like a different kind of environmental problem.
I mean, I guess a point I wanted to squeeze into this, but I packed this too tightly with questions, with interesting questions, was the fact that we'll have seen most of the warming by the time we've halved CO2 emissions, because it's a cumulative effect, right? I'm seeing nods generally.
That's
Yeah, so
correct.
I
What's
think
the
that's an
question?
interesting. I think it's interesting but reaching a halving of emissions is perhaps more important than reaching net zero. That first half of tackling the climate crisis from here has a bigger impact than the second half of hitting net zero.
I mean, I think it really depends what perspective you have. If you're sort of thinking like an imaginary global utilitarian policymaker, or if you're thinking about somebody who's like living in rural or big city Indonesia or wherever, where you just care about the harms. And then, you care on a kind of human life scale. And I think if it was seriously part of it, you'd take SRM pretty seriously because the evidence that it would be beneficial is pretty strong. And the question about emissions cuts versus CDR is a wash.
Great. Maybe another question from our audience.
Sure. I'll direct this one to Matt. Take it as however you wish. How do you factor derailment risks in emissions projections?
What do you mean by derailment? Like just the
I think this is I think this is the idea that climate change, either politically or physically, will have effects which undermine efforts to cut emissions.
I see. Well, I think the physical side of that is pretty unlikely, right? So as we get richer, we tend to get better technologically at doing everything that we want, including cut emissions, right? Most of the countries that are cutting emissions are rich countries. Um, if something derails, if something derails our economies, it's going to cut our emissions, right? Not in ways we like. Either case, I don't see a kind of physical derailment that leads our emissions to explode. And in terms of the politics, kind of going back to David's point earlier about what is optimal and what is utilitarian, I think that the only thing I can imagine derailing the politics of emissions cuts in a long-term sense is either the economics of renewables, which are currently good and getting better, stop getting better and start getting worse, which I don't think is super likely, or we get 2.5, 3 degrees warmer and we find out that it isn't as bad as we thought. In which case, then there's a utilitarian question of, is the derailment necessarily a bad thing? I don't think that's super likely either. So I would say I don't think it's super likely in either case.
Great. Perhaps I'll just ask one last one before we wrap up. That came in earlier from General Mendel de Suarez. Who would take responsibility for those vulnerable to the known and unknown negative impacts of geoengineering? That's a big question, but I don't know if you can unpack some of the questions about taking responsibility for negative impacts, David.
Nobody knows. I think any more than we know really how that's happening for lots of other problems. I mean, I think it's sad but realistic to say that countries do lots of things that impose harms on other countries and other individuals in complicated ways. And that will surely be true with SRM. And there are compensations that we have. There are treaties that have real compensations, and there are non-treaty mechanisms and mechanisms inside countries where people are compensated for harms. Lots of those, remember, don't actually have to be explicit about what caused the harm. So if countries have different kinds of welfare policies, they'll implicitly counteract harms of any cause. So I think the answer is it's really complicated, and we just don't know how it will happen if SRM is used.
Actually, having said that was the last question. I will ask one more last question from Lloyd Whitman, perhaps to Simon or anyone else. Does anyone want to predict at which COP SRM, solar geoengineering, might be seriously discussed? Simon, do you want to first crack at that and then others?
I mean, based on the fact that it took, what, like 30 years to start seriously talking about fossil fuels, and then even that's proved pretty challenging. And based on the fact that, introducing new concepts into the COP, typically takes a really long time. I'm not necessarily expecting to see that anytime soon.
I think it might happen sooner, but I don't think it happens organically. I don't disagree with Simon. I don't think it happens organically through the kind of COP UNFCCC process. I think that will take very, very long. But I think what is more likely, but I couldn't give a meaningful probability, is that some set of countries will actually announce something that forces it on the table, something that basically is a pathway to some kind of limited deployment. And if so, then boom, it's on the agenda. And my guess, I guess I'll say this way. If it's seriously on the agenda at a COP in the next 10 or 15 years, it's not because it kind of organically got that way. It's because some countries did something that drives it on the agenda.
Yeah, just to quickly add on that, I think it'll be very nonlinear, kind of like we're seeing with adaptation in the last two COPs, right? It's going to be not at all, not at all, not at all, and then boom, it's going to be huge. Probably, as David said, driven by some countries' action.
Excellent. Well, thanks all. I think we're now 10 minutes over, so I think we've taken plenty of your time. This has been fabulous. I think it's been a fantastic discussion. Thanks to the audience members who hung along and all our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for organizing this, guys. This is great.